Okay, a few weeks ago I did a video on Titan arguing about what his character was meant to represent in the context of the narrative of Megamind. And you can find a link to that video in the description in case you'd like to see that video first. But one thing I briefly touched on in that video that I'd like to elaborate on is how Megamind isn't really a villain despite the fact that he's designated as the bad guy for most of the movie. And I'm going to go over that aspect of his character in more detail because as a man who's written a few books himself, I honestly feel the writing behind Megamind was quite brilliant. But before we get into it, I would just like to give my usual warning that there will be spoilers for this movie ahead. So if you haven't seen it yet but plan to at some point, you should probably come back to this video another day. You have been warned. Alright, so to start at the beginning, this movie was originally pitched on the premise of what if Lex Luthor defeated Superman and took it from there? However, the final product turns out to not be a literal answer to that question, and in that lies the brilliance of Megamind's character. Because the thing is, any Superman fan already knows the answer to that question. And to give a very abbreviated version of it, Lex Luthor is a rich businessman who wants to be even richer and is more than willing to employ anything from morally questionable to downright supervillainous schemes in order to achieve that goal. And it's Superman who prevents these schemes from ever working out. So if Lex Luthor were to ever actually defeat or even kill Superman, it's obvious what he would do next. Employ his schemes to get even richer unopposed, gaining untold wealth and power at the expense of others. In other words, defeating Superman is only a means to an end for Lex Luthor, because he's what stands in the way of him achieving his actual goals. Now, obviously, there is a lot more to their dynamic than that, and I'm sure there are certain interpretations of Luther that don't apply as well to this, but I'm just giving the simplified version of how he's generally portrayed in order to demonstrate the point that he has plans and goals beyond just defeating Superman. But in Megamind, it isn't like that. He doesn't have any long-term goals beyond defeating Metro Man, so when he finally does, he quickly finds himself bored and without a purpose, because for him it's all about the challenge, not the victory. In other words, he's the type who only wants things he can't have because that's what makes getting them fun. And when he can get literally anything unopposed, he doesn't want any of it as there's no point to having it. So the obvious question then is, where's the difference between the two? And the answer to that is fairly obvious as well. That simply put, Megamind isn't an actual bad guy. He only plays the part of one. As I said in my previous video, he sees himself as more of a video game villain than anything, and at several points even refers to the whole superhero-supervillain dynamic as a game. Because as the flashbacks at the beginning of the movie show us, his constant bullying and getting no recognition for anything he does causes him to believe that the only thing he's good at is being an opponent for Metro Man. And if that makes him an evil supervillain, then in his own words, he will be the best evil supervillain of them all. But as he himself points out, to him it's all about the presentation rather than his actions. Because it's clear that he means nobody any actual harm, always going out of his way to make sure nobody gets hurt in his schemes, is shown to be really uncomfortable with the thought of killing, and just causes a ruckus at the worst of times. And yet, he has all the hallmarks of a supervillain. The Evil Lair, the impressive artillery of weapons, the evil clothes, his extremely over-the-top demeanor, his kidnapping a girl and threatening her with all the cliches, and pulling no punches and trying to kill the town's beloved superhero. So my point is, at first glance, it's easy to see why Megamind is viewed as by everybody as the most evil, threatening supervillain ever, because he does a perfect job of presenting himself as much. But then you analyze his actions and realize he's about the least evil villain you could ever come across. Because again, he never tries to hurt anybody, and this is especially evident to Roxanne, as he's kidnapped her so many times that by the time the movie starts, she knows all his threats are empty, and that he'd never actually use them on her, and hurls everything he has only at Metro Man because deep down he knows it either won't actually hurt him or that he'll get away before it does. Look at his reaction when Metro Man pretends to be weakened. He's genuinely baffled. He never expected his plan to actually work in a million years. Heck, he had already given up and was halfway out the door. And you also notice that when he hurls the skeleton at him, that Megamind's first impulse is to be relieved that Metro Man survived, despite the fact that he was the one trying to kill him. As I said before, Megamind puts on a great show, but when it actually comes down to it, he is by no means evil and instead just playing the part, believing it is his purpose to be the mortal enemy of Metro Man and always lose to him. It's just one big game to him that he's happy to play for the rest of his life. And honestly, the only character who seems to fully realize this is Metro Man himself. I mean, I'm sure at first he saw Megamind as a genuinely evil threat, but it's clear by the events of the movie he knows exactly what he really is. I mean, just look at his super speed ability. With that alone, it's made clear that if he saw him as a real threat or took him in any way seriously, he could easily defeat him in seconds. And this honestly then leads to some brilliance on his part as well. Because if Megamind is holding back and only being a villain on a superficial level, then Metro Man is as well. He holds back so that Megamind can have a genuine fight, seeing that what he really wants and that he is an actual threat, and make himself look like a huge hero to Metro City at the same time. Until the events of the movie, that is, where he realizes by that point that they're both just going through the motions and that the whole thing is honestly pointless. So he finally breaks the cycle in order to both find his own purpose in life as well as quite possibly make Megamind realize that he doesn't actually want to be the bad guy. Because one thing that isn't often brought up about Metro Man is if he's realized that Megamind isn't actually a real villain or threat, then that doesn't make him a real hero, does it? And if all he's doing is essentially putting on an elaborate show, then what purpose does he really have? Again, it makes a lot more sense when you really think about it that he'd want to find another purpose, considering it's clear that he's the only one to see Megamind the way he actually is. And on that topic, that's probably also why he had no issue leaving Metro City in the hands of Megamind, because he knew that for all his showmanship, he was never going to do anything that bad and would probably clean up his act in the end. But to get back to Megamind, the brilliant part is that he isn't just playing the role of the villain for fun either, but also because it's a genuine coping mechanism for him. When nobody would accept him as a kid, and the only recognition he got was by causing problems for Metro Man to fix, he decided that he would take active pride in people hating him and trying to cause problems. But we later see deep down he's actually a pretty insecure man who would happily become the good guy if somebody would just give him a chance. But whenever anything goes wrong, he immediately falls back on being the villain, because it's honestly the only way he can accept himself. When Roxanne dumps him, he decides to put on a huge show in his battle with Titan. And when it looks like he's going to destroy the city, he feels immense guilt in that he can't do anything about it. So he literally turns himself into prison, accepting his role as the bad guy on every level at that moment. Basically, whenever Megamind feels bad about himself, he immediately turns to his bad guy persona as a way to deal with it. And that's why I've always found that shot brilliant, where he walks up to the cracked mirror looking at his own reflection sadly and only smiles once he's disguised himself as Bernard, because at that point in the story, he sees himself as the villain he no longer desires to be, but everybody will always hate him as, while Bernard is the person he wants to be. A man accepted by everybody, but especially the girl he likes. And honestly, that was a really good way to portray him. Because a lot of other writers might have written him as simply a pure evil bad guy who grows a conscience after some horrible event makes him see the error of his ways, and use the fact that it was a kids' movie as a justification for that. But instead, his good nature is foreshadowed from the moment the movie starts, and it's clear throughout that his villainy is driven by his search for a purpose rather than actually out of a desire to do anything evil. And of course, his relationship with Roxanne also does a great job of bringing out the kind man he actually is. In other words, when you really look at it, the movie is less about the villain becoming the hero as the villain coming to terms with the fact that he actually wants to be the hero. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it off there. I do have more I could say on this topic, but I think the video's gone on long enough. Though if you're interested in what else I have to say, please let me know in the comments and I'll consider doing another video for that. But I'd also like you to let me know, do you believe Megamind is a really well-written character, especially when it comes to the fact that he's a harmless villain who's mainly that way to cope with his loneliness? Or do you believe I'm giving the writers way too much credit? Please feel free to tell me that in the comments as well. And as usual, you don't have to agree with me, and I've got no issue with you if you do. Thank you all for watching. I really appreciate your support, and I hope to see you all next time.